Hi, everyone. Thank you, Thunderhead Engineering, for organizing this great conference. My name's Danielle Aucoin, and I'm a Master's in Fire Safety Engineering student at York University, located up in Toronto. I'm here today along with my colleague, Dr. John Gales, who is a professor at York University. So my research over the past year or so has been a project through the university, also funded, and we've been in collaboration with ARUP. So I've been looking at stadiums, and more specifically human behavior during post-event egress. And before I dive into the experimental trials and modeling I've carried out to date, I just wanted to give you a bit of context as to why this is a credible area of concern. So taking a brief overview of some stadium disasters dating back to the 1980s, you'll notice that these catastrophes occur all over the globe. So independent of country and culture, stadiums are very susceptible for a number of reasons. One of those reasons being just the sheer amount of people gathered in one place at the same time, as well as the uncertainty when it comes to modeling the human behavior within these stadiums. So in addition to fire, these evacuations can be caused by a number of reasons, including weather evacuations, acts of terrorism. So we saw that last year at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, the bombing there, as well as structural collapses. But the thing all these potential causes have in common are they all result in a mass onset of egress, which ultimately leads to crowd crushes. So I took a look at about 30 stadium disasters dating back a century and found that over 40% of those that did involve fatalities, the deaths themselves were due to the crowd crushes or lack of capacity and not necessarily the initial source of the incident itself, such as the fire or the structural collapse. So I'm going to show you a brief clip here. Hopefully it works. And without disclosing the name or identifying the stadium here, this is the stadium that I've been conducting trials at over the past year. And this fire occurred this year. And what happened here was some fans managed to get some flares into the stands and set them off through those massive flags they were waving, and they landed in the stands as well as on the field. And taking a different topical view here, you'll notice that some people began to remove themselves from the situation, but you also get the people that set the flares off themselves lingering around with a sense of avoidance. I don't think they really realized the potential danger of the situation and probably wouldn't realize it unless an authoritative figure came up to them and told them how potentially dangerous it actually is. So you get them conforming to their own group and not making any attempt to egress there. And this raises quite a few safety concerns, especially given that it's known that jurisdictions will be increasing the number of stadium projects over the next few decades. And not only will they be increasing the number, but they're going to be building these stadiums to a larger capacity. And the reason for that being that more seating allows for a higher revenue potential. So this financial incentive to build stadiums to a larger capacity makes egress planning even that much more important. But not only is it important during the design phase, but it's important to adopt an approach that integrates management protocols from day one as well. So poor signage, poor security, poor management protocols can also put occupants at risk. So in terms of the design benchmarks that are used in stadium design, you're going to get those on 3 levels, being international, national, and a more local level. So globally, the Sports Ground Safety Authority has developed the Green Guide. And the Green Guide lays out many requirements, one of interest being something called the 8-minute rule. So this states that under emergency conditions, all occupants should be able to egress from a stadium between 2.5 and 8 minutes, depending on the level of fire risk inherent there. Under normal conditions, all occupants should be able to leave a stadium in 8 minutes. On a national level, you'll get the NFPA. One rule of interest here would be NFPA states that the stands themselves should be able to clear to the nearest egress concourse within 11 minutes, and from that point in the egress concourse, NFPA provides a maximum distance, not a time, that they should be able to get from that point to the nearest exit. On a more local level, so York University, we're located up in Ontario, OBC will also outline further stair detailings, capacities, and further details for seated occupancy. But the thing, if you look at all of these standards, they cover many of the same aspects, but they also contradict each other in several ways. And this is one thing we wanted to take a look at. So speaking back to the 8-minute rule that I mentioned, if you look at how this rule originated, it was conducted from a series of studies created over 50 years ago. And the basis behind it was that people become stressed and subject to anxiety when they're subjected to queues in crowded areas for longer than 8 minutes. So knowing there was a need for further research, I went out last year and conducted 2 experimental trials. And although our experiments were not conducted under emergency scenario for obvious ethical reasons, it's important to note that stadium performance, how that performs in normal egress, will be a strong indicator of how it's going to perform under emergency conditions. So we conducted 2 trials, and this stadium itself has a capacity of 24,000, and both trials, the attendance was over 90%. The first trial had all 3 exit points open, so you'll see the red arrow there, the blue arrow, and the yellow arrow was the east exit. And we set up cameras to capture all 3 of these exit points, as well as the egress routes and the stands. The second trial, the east bridge there was actually closed, kind of presenting a worst case scenario in terms of densities. And the reason it was closed was they were erecting the temporary stands you see on the left there, which provide an additional 12,000 seats in capacity for special events. So after taking a look at all that data and compiling it, I first looked at the gate utilization of each of those exit points during egress. And the first thing you'll notice here, if you look at the utilization of gate 1 during ingress and egress, and the north walkway during ingress and egress for trial 1 and 2, you'll notice that all those numbers are within 5%. And this kind of aligns with the well-known phenomenon that people tend to exit where they came in. And this is a concern when it comes to fire safety engineering, because you might plan for people taking the most logical route, but the reality is they are likely going to take the one that they're most familiar with. Another interesting takeaway from this data is you'll see in trial 2 there, where the gate was closed, the majority of people that initially would have taken the east bridge, gate 1 there, took that extra capacity. And if you look at the way the stadium's set up, you logically would think that they would have wanted to take the north walkway because it goes out to the same parking facilities and transit facilities that those people might have taken to come in. But reviewing the footage, you see that that north walkway was subject to standstills at certain points and very dense, and people gravitated towards the wider exit and the one that did have a higher flow rate and provided that capacity, despite that they might have had to walk further around to get to where they came from. I next set up a little time lapse of the events themselves. And on the y-axis there, you'll see people egressed out of the stadium. On the x-axis, that's time elapsed. And the black line there in the middle is the final game buzzer. And when we started filming was when we saw about 100 occupants leave the stadium over a period of 3 minutes. So this was well before the game ended itself. And that measure was arbitrary, but it was a measure that we applied in both trials. So you'll notice here that the post-egress time was 17.5 minutes. So well in excess of 8 minutes, as you can see. Another interesting thing here was we noticed about a third of the spectators left prior to the end of the game. And this was a trend that we observed in both trials. And the interesting thing here is this was a final playoff game. These tickets were very expensive, so you would think that people would be inclined and committed to stay towards the end, but that was not the case that we observed. The post-game egress for trial 2 was 33.5 minutes, and this represents about a 90% increase from the first trial, just due to that one exit closure. So after looking at the raw data, I set up a scale model in MassMotion pedestrian modeling software, and this is a software developed internally by ARUP through their Oasis software division. And the default agent profile for MassMotion is called the Fruin commuter, and this was developed from a series of studies in the New York subway system back in the 1970s. And the limitation to this profile for my given scenario was that it applies a nominal distribution of walking speeds, a blended average, and you can't get a demographic representation from it. So I decided to do my modeling with Fruin as a benchmark, but also apply the studies of Aucoin, who did rigorous testing to develop average normal walking speeds for children under 18, young adults from 19 to 35, adults from 36 to 65, and elderly. To determine my pre-movement times, I took a look at the footage and found that they ranged between 5 seconds and just over a minute, but we did not consider spectators that were staying to partake in post-game activities and go onto the field. Demographics of the trials were determined from looking at the footage and taking about a 20% sample size of the population, and it was found that over half the stadium consisted of adults, about a third young adults, 12% elderly, and about half that children. So first I wanted to set up my validation simulations, and I ran 2 scenarios, and I calibrated these to mimic the trials themselves exactly. And I ran each with the Fruin and the Ando speeds, applied the demographics observed at the events, did trial 1 with all the gates open, trial 2 with 1 closed, and I populated that with the actual number of people left in the stadium at that final buzzer. So before diving into the numbers, I took a look at a little bit of qualitative validation and just made sure that the walkways in the footage looked at certain stairwells, certain points, and made sure that they were subject to the same amount of densities as that in the model, and I found it was very representative of what was going on. So in terms of the egress times, the model for trial 1, it came out to be 17 minutes, 21 seconds. The trial itself, 17 minutes and a half, so we found that was fairly representative. Looking at simulation 2, came out to about 27 minutes. The trial itself was around 33 and a half. So we found this to still be in reasonable range. Of course, there are a few underlying factors that could account for this variability, one of them being MassMotion is not able to fully represent group behavior in a stadium yet, and a lot of people come to events in families, and when you're walking in a group, it's well known that you're walking at a bit slower rate. So that could be just one of many reasons for that. So once we found that the models were relatively in line, decided to run some predictive scenarios and populated the stadium at full capacity, so 24,000, and ran simulation 3 on the top there and 4. What I did here was, you'll see there's 4 subsets for each simulation here. Number 1 just being the default Fruin commuter, B, the demographics we observed at the events. 3C and 4C decided to run the stadium model with a higher population of young people, so the fastest average walking speed we had, and put about half the people with the fastest walking speed. And then 3D and 4D, we put about half elderly in there just to see if demographics played a role in these post-egress times. And what we found here was for scenario 3, the post-egress times ranged between about 21 and 29 minutes, and about the same range for scenario 4. And the interesting thing here is if you tabulate up the average walking speeds of scenario 3C and 4C and compare that to the slower group, so 4D and 3D, you'll notice that 3C actually represents almost like a 70% increase in average walking speed. But if you look at the difference in the total post-egress between the two, it only represents about 20 to 30% longer time. So this really indicates that demographics played a slight role in the post-total egress time, but it wasn't directly translational. And the architecture here was really the governing factor, and the congestion and the bottlenecks in the stadium. So evidently, all our egress times were well in excess of those 8 minutes, and we didn't really see any confidence that this stadium could achieve that benchmark in a safe manner. The egress was not of high stress rate, and that the architecture was the governing factor here. Clearly, there still is a lot of room for further stadium human behavior research in the future. And although this is just one more data set added to the mix, with each and every data set, we're on our way towards providing designers with more confidence towards their models. Thank you, and I'd be happy to field any questions.
Any questions for Danielle? Kevin.
I'm just curious, where did that 8 minutes come from? That seems insane. I can't even imagine, evacuating an entire stadium in 8 minutes.
It's from the SkyCon report, if anyone has heard of that. It's a series of studies carried out by Jake Pauls back in about the early 1900s, mid 1900s in the UK at a series of about 14 soccer matches. That I don't know, but it's supposed to be representational and translated to all structures.
Did they evacuate onto the field?
No, I believe it was just one exit because it was in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to have a lot of exit capacity. So I think it's clear from this that the geometry, was the limiting factor here. But
you said it was at 8 minutes that the stress level is what that means, that they panic.
Yeah, that was the origin behind it and the philosophy. Yeah.
any other questions?
He said their stress level went up after 8 minutes, but was it true panic or just frustration of not being able to get out of the stadium?
So that was from the SkyCon report, not from our trials. I think it was just a physical reaction on his face that he realized. Stress can manifest itself in other ways as well, apart from physical means. Did that answer your question?
No, I was just curious, how irritated the people were at that 8 minute level.
Yeah, so all I know about that is what's in the report, and it was just evident frustration that they weren't able to leave, and they were subject to standstills and sitting in queues. So that's how this benchmark was developed.
Other questions? All right, thanks again, Danielle.